Hello, I hope you are well. I would like to thank Dr. Garcia Gonzalez and your group for your interest in my project. And I would like also to add that a lot of these ideas are a result of my 2-year-long collaboration with Macarena, which I appreciate very much. And I would also like to say that my visit to the UK and my research here at Anglia Ruskin University, where I'm currently based, is funded by the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange. Let me begin with an explanation. I'm not an education specialist. I'm a children's literature scholar, but I think that children's literature studies, education, and childhood studies intersect. And these proximities of these fields result in interesting translations, right, of conceptual tools from one field into another, which in turn produces very interesting openings. And I experienced these proximities when I was in the UK 2 years ago, working on Marie Skłodowska-Curie research project, also at Anglia Ruskin University. It was a reader response project with young readers responding to a fantasy novel. But the teachers with whom I worked supported it because it corresponded to the curriculum, and also the children themselves could relate their experiences from the classroom to what we were doing. And one of the schools, two schools with which I collaborated at that time was John Clare Primary School in Helpstone. Now, John Clare, I'm sure you know, was a romantic proto-environmentalist, a poet who spent most of his life in Helpstone. And there at that school, I found what I think is a most illustrative example of why, as Simon Kvesi argues, John Clare is very present in contemporary culture. So each year, all pupils of that school write poems on a topic selected by John Clare Society and participate in a competition it sponsors. As I learned, once the theme of the competition is announced, usually in spring, the teachers introduce relevant contents to the general curriculum and provide the pupils with examples of texts related to the focus of the competition, including Clare's poems. The children are also encouraged to decorate their poems with drawings. The finale of the competition takes place during the Midsummer Cushion Ceremony, itself an important event of the John Clare Society Festival, held annually in Helpstone, on or close to the date of Clare's birthday, which is July the 13th. And of course, it's uncertain whether this festival will be organized this year. Now, the Midsummer Cushions is a local folk custom of creating small flower decorations that are placed on window ledges or in front of the houses. The children make the decorations at school, then they walk from the school to the local church and put their decorations, their Midsummer Cushions, on Clare's grave. And then they enter the church to hear the jury's verdict and to receive prizes. And having become intrigued both by the diversity of the poem's contents and also by the creative process in which these children engage every year, I realized that these texts should be taken seriously, not only as writing exercises or competition entries, but first and foremost as children's literature authored by children. Texts written by children are actually being increasingly recognized as constituting a vital contribution to children's literature, even if they originate in adult-controlled institutions and are perceived as developmentally valuable steps towards adulthood. As Rachel Conrad notes, children's creative work and participation in literary practices and production of literature is a component of their agency. And of course, calling attention to this form of agency in turn acknowledges children as producers of culture. And this is, of course, posited by Articles 13 and 31 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Also, according to the kinship model of child-adult relations proposed by Mara Guber, children's creative endeavors or as, for example, Peter Cumming calls it, another children's literature, should be seen in relation to as not as radically separate from or less competent than those the texts written by adults, even, right, if these texts written by children are mediated by and negotiated with adults. Such a perspectival flip, as Maragube calls it, entails a revisioning of kind of power relations, power differentials between adult authors and young readers and writers, towards imagining how young people and grown-ups have experiences in common, including creativity, including writing. Currently, circa 600 poems are stored in folders available at the school's reception, and although they have not ended up in the bin, as happens to much children's writing, according to RSP et al., they are not publicized in any way to a wider audience. The way in which this archive of poems is preserved, organized, displayed, and recirculated has been decided only by adults. As mentioned earlier, this collection is also inaccessible to broader audience in the UK and internationally. And these poems grasped me so much that I photographed all of them with the hope that I would be able to reread them and work on them in the future. And that happened 2 years ago, right, when I was here. And when I came back to Poland, I kept thinking about these poems, and I applied for funding for a project that would enable me to study not only the existing poems, which I can do from home, I don't have to come to the UK to do that, but I also wanted to study the very process of creation that happens each year at John Clare Primary School. Now, Simon Kövesi argues that many of writers engaging with Clare are interested in his understanding of nature, his proto-environmentalism, his botanizing eye, and Clare's profile continues to benefit from acts of personal identification, the creative purposes to which his life and work are put range far beyond commentary on art and the artist, and they deserve, as Kövesi argues, more critical attention than they currently receive as serious interventions into ways in which we might understand Clare. And I think that my project, which I titled Ecopoetic Entanglements, Children's Poetry Mobilizing John Clare's Artistic Legacy, offers one of possible ways to pursue such contemporary Clares. It expands the kind of transhistorical perspective mentioned by Kövesi by adding an intergenerational aspect and the perspective of children's literature studies and childhood studies, and also the framework of new materialism. And it happens through trying to show how meaning and matter are entangled within larger networks of nature cultures that integrate Clare's poems, children's poems, the school, Helpston itself, nature around Helpston, teachers, children, parents, right? All these people engaged in the creative process. But to do that, I think we need to allow ourselves, as Conrad puts it, to be moved and to stand behind the words written by children, to accord them the respect due to literature. And this is what my project proposes. So it proposes to complement representational literary research on Clare and his impact on contemporary culture by taking seriously the power, the vitality and agency and materiality of texts written by children. And I think in this way it may shed additional light on the significance of Clare's poetry as constituting the lived creative experiences of contemporary children, not only their knowledge, but also the relationalities, thoughts, feelings, bodies, and senses. Now, a colleague of mine remarked that these children, right, have been cleared by adults and by the institution, by the fact that they participate in the competition year after year. But I think that my project, as I will try to show in a moment, enables them to negotiate this condition of being cleared to some extent. And I have identified 3 objectives. The first one is critical readings of selected children's poems. I will come back to the other 2 later. But with a colleague, I drafted a chapter for a collection on plants in children's literature, in which we rely on critical plant studies and botanical criticism to read a sample of children's poems on deforestation. They were written in the school year 2017-2018, and the topic of the competition then was deforestation. Working on their poems, the children discussed two poems by John Clare, The Maple Tree and The Shepherd's Tree. Now Clare, with his kind of characteristic accuracy, immediacy, clarity, physical sensibility, contemplates intimate relationships between the trees and what we could call a kind of phytophilic lyrical eye. And although in the children's poems, the lyrical eye is the tree itself, Clare's and the children's poems both decenter human agency and stress solidarity and interdependence of all life forms, both locally and globally. And our close readings of these poems reveal that the child authors do not see trees as lower, sessile, passive, non-sentient forms of life, or as symbols or metaphors. In contrast, they appreciate trees being in the world, as Ryan puts it, and they create detailed, often intimate portrayals of the agency of trees, the agency that co-shapes the existence of other beings. And since most of the poems creatively integrate word and drawing, we also analyze the children's visual depictions of trees as important elements of the meaning-making process. Interestingly, while the children's poems are pervaded with a sense of irrevocable loss and the premonition of the destruction of all life on Earth, very few pictures accompanying the verbal lie convey equally negative emotions and ideas. And by omitting these references to deforestation practices, we think, right, they open broader sense-making and communicative possibilities. We would like to think that the colorful drawings of healthy trees indicate both a lost past and a future that may still happen if humanity reduces its negative impact on the environment. Hence, the combination of the warning and hope emerging from the poems exemplifies the eco-critical workings of botanical imagination. It encourages readers to abandon anthropocentric outlooks on the environment and imagine humanity's relations to nature as non-hegemonic and non-appropriative. Now, the realization of the project hopefully would make it possible to conduct a study of poems written last year, and the theme then was birds' words. And I would like to work with children on a kind of polyphonic co-authored article with children and also teachers or parents as partners in the research process, contributing to its shape, interpretation of results, and dissemination. And I think that this kind of redefined network of relationships with the researcher, minimizing her own role as the supervisor of the research process in favor of a facilitator, enables rethinking the construction of knowledge along more egalitarian lines by putting child and adult stakeholders on an equal footing and foregrounding the insider perspective of a given community. So, of course, in this case, this approach would allow for initiating the research process not with the researcher's agenda, but with the pupils and their teachers, critical reflection on the ongoing engagements with Clare's legacy. I've published 2 articles co-authored with children, and so I know it is doable. They were published in peer-reviewed international journals. And I would like to try again. It is very complex, of course, and very demanding, but we'll see. It could be done in the current circumstances online via Google Docs. So right now I'm in touch with the school about online possibilities for conducting the project. But to explore fully the material semiotic sphere from which the children's poems emerge, I also propose the following 2 objectives that demonstrate how multiple collective and individual encounters between Clare's works, the children's poems, and contemporary children, adults, and their life worlds result in new entanglements of meta and meaning. And I hope that in this way, these two objectives complement the approach proposed in objective 1 by moving away from kind of one-directional and hierarchical understanding of the influence of Clare's poems as models for the children's practice. So the first of these objectives is the John Clare Anarchive. And let me start with explaining the concept of the Anarchive. So it is a concept or kind of methodology as well, developed by Brian Masumi and Erin Manning. So contrary to the traditional archive, which documents and preserves past activities by removing them from recirculation, the Anarchive activates the content of the archive through exposing it to new relationalities and entanglements, new collaborations, new interpretative processes. It in a way troubles the archive. The Anarchive is about effective and material processes of production. It may stimulate new compositions, multimodal outcomes, depending, of course, on activities and materials to which we want to expose the archive. It may mutate if we keep it open to new users, materials, elements. It is about events, about encounters and happenings, enabling collaboration. As Masumi says, the Anarchive is also a cross-platform phenomenon between media, between verbal and material expressions, between digital and offline archiving, and most of all, as he says, between all of the various archival forms it may take and the live, collaborative interactions that reactivate the unarchival traces and in turn create new ones. But we need starting point, we need the archive. And in my case, of course, the archive is the poems written at John Clare Primary School, currently stored in folders and grouped into years and classes. And I think that through the unarchival practice, we could rupture this order and inspire new creative processes through encounters between children, teachers, parents, and other adults. And I was hoping to engage colleagues from Angia Ruskin and from University of Cambridge as well, who work on romantic poetry. And it can be done through exposing this archive of poems to a range of other texts, including Clare's poems, materials, media, social interactions. So it would be, in a way, about creation of kind of counter-archive. So it's about happening among texts, humans, materials, and effects, about reading text through other texts. But here reading is not just kind of a once-off activity, but it's active doing and making together, maybe what Haraway would call a sympoiesis, involving others and one's own texts. And in this way, John Clare's poems and the children's poems could become living, vibrant, as Bennett calls them, texts, constituting new ecologies of discursive and material interdependencies, as well as new ways of reading and writing. And of course, the expression of these connections may take the form of new text, drawings, mashups, videos, photographs, depending on participants' interests. The Unarchive would make it possible to document, I think, in unprecedented ways, the effective and material relevance of Clare's works as a source of new creative processes and a kind of force generating relational experiences that transcend age divides and professional hierarchies. Such use of the Unarchive may serve as a kind of, I think, useful, productive pedagogical model that could be applied in literature classes, in creative writing classes. But I think with any collections that are available at schools, it could be children's toys, it could be children's drawings, textbooks, and the unarchival practice could encourage kind of multifaceted, effective and performative practice of engagements with all these archives. Now, this vibrant ecology of the Unarchive that we could potentially create could be reenacted at John Clare Cottage during the John Clare Society Festival. It could also be preserved on the school's website and further expanded through new iterations by future pupils attending the school, or more broadly by other readers interested in eco-poetry. But The particular forms of representing the unarchived would also be selected jointly by child and adult participants. So once again, just to sum up, the unarchive and this method enables joint participation, collaboration, relationalities, exchange of experiences and ideas and affects. It can be intergenerational, it can encourage intergenerational dialogue. It encourages also reflection on representation. It encourages experimentation with spaces and with materials. And it doesn't have to be a one-off thing, it can be revisited by the same group or by a new group. But while this objective and the first objective that I mentioned concern the already existing poems, the project also explores the significance of Clare's legacy revealed through children's work on new texts. As the creative process occurring at the school is mostly individual and oriented on the achievement of outcomes, Objective 3 proposes to combine it with collective reading, interpretation, and writing situated in specific time and place and responsive to people's connections with a particular environment and also with other human and non-human beings. So this third objective is titled Walking, Reading, Writing in John Clare Country. So I'm sure you know, in the late 20th century, the potential of walking and more broadly movement methodologies as animating the spatial and sensory dynamics of our perception and experience began to be appreciated as a kind of methodological tool, alternative to static modes of inquiry. So in these methodologies, the activity of walking is seen not only as movement across space, but also as a mode of experimentation, enabling effective, open, and relational modes of expression grounded in the materiality of bodies, the environment, our sensory experiences, also non-visual experiences. So walking together, as Karen Malone stresses, is about a shared rhythm of movement. It encourages conversation, companionability, and the sharing of understandings. So my project relies on walking methodologies to explore the relevance of Clare's poetry to the children's poetic endeavors by seeing reading as both activating and activated by human and non-human bodies at moments of unpredictable and momentary encounters. It proposes to form a kind of intergenerational mobile focus group as a collective interactive method enabling the emergence and observation of the situated and embodied creative process that may remain unnoticed in school-based interactions. So ideally, the group would consist of children and adults sharing the responses to Clare's poems, ideally selected by the participants as well jointly. When walking together near Helpstone, routes would not be predetermined but decided among all the participants. The text created as a result of these walks could serve as a basis for children's individual work on competition entries. Consequently, although the children's poems inevitably reflect certain predetermined instructions and models of intellectual practice, including Clare's poetry as one of such models, they would also constitute dynamic and fluid experiences of language, sound, form, and vision as shaped by particular landscapes. Simultaneously, such an approach would enable to gauge the significance of Clare's poems as culturally active agents unbound by their historical context and experienced kind of on the move as entangled with the world here and now. The walking with practice would allow for witnessing and collecting data about unfolding transient, embodied and multisensual processes of creation experienced individually and through companionship and also at participants' pace. Now, as you have seen, the realization of objectives 2 and 3 would involve qualitative methods. It could be the use of videos, photographs, class discussions, but they could be jointly decided and composed by the child and other participants. However, as the project is process-oriented, I'm sure you have noticed this, and it focuses more on things in the making than on things already made, it is also post-qualitative. It remains open to practical experimentation. It's not about any predefined set of questions. It's about a process about the kind of dynamic unfolding, about unpredictable but productive provocations, about happenings, encounters, energies, and intensities. And I think that such methodological flexibility makes the research process responsive to the participants' own inquiries, and it enables them to define their own commitment to the project. And finally, it hopes to not just to describe all these processes or just to trace them, but also to let us all engage with them. Maybe it could be called as, could be seen in terms of deep hanging out, as defined by Haraway after Gertz, hanging out with Claire's poems, children's poems, the children themselves, also other adults, and the landscape. Of course, the project is pretty risky on its own, regardless of the current situation. It requires of me to be part of this investigated phenomena. It requires of me to take up a kind of vulnerable approach as a non-expert, but of course vulnerability also in a way enables openness and receptivity to others' ideas. Well, I do wish me luck, and I hope that it's not just wishful thinking, that we will be able to conduct this project, maybe via online tools, technologies, which I think could be very interesting in itself. And again, I guess that children would be more expert than myself at using these technologies. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, I would be most grateful. Looking forward to your comments. Please do not hesitate to get in touch. I'm very willing to share this article on deforestation poems if you are interested. Thank you very much for your time. Stay well.